My guest this morning is Bijoun Eric Jordan. He is a high school English teacher just finishing his 19th year. His greatest professional pleasure is stroking enjoyment of words and ideas, and after school making students world travelers. Bijoun studied education at New York University, followed by a gap year abroad, then a master's in English literature at Hunter College. His essay critiquing the right wing's recent efforts to undermine racial justice initiatives through the, quote, boogeyman, unquote, of critical race theory appears in the new collection, Illmatic Consequences, the Clapback to opponents of critical race theory, inspired by rapper Nas's debut album, Illmatic. A self-professed nerd and staunch advocate of the Oxford comma, Jordan is also a consummate hip-hop head and a recovering lyricism addict whose other passions include politics, culture, gaming, and creativity. He lives and loves in Brooklyn with his wife, daughter, and son. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Reading Circle microphone, none other than Bijoun Eric Jordan. Bijoun, good morning again.
Good morning. Glad to be here.
And I am glad to have you here. As I shared with you, I know I shared with somebody, there's been many of you who contributed to the book Illmatic Consequences, but very few of you who took advantage of actually coming on to appear on the show. I think you're only the second contributor to appear, and we're going to continuously work on getting some of the others to come on as well. So I tell you what, I don't work off of a question sheet or a question list per se, but there are certain questions I do ask in terms of helping the audience kind of understand how we got to where we are. So I just read your bio in terms of you being, I believe you called yourself a nerd, and you're an English teacher, and you're an African-American male teacher. So I wanted to roll the clock back a little bit and kind of see, where did all that start? I mean, did you want to be a teacher as a child, or where did that kind of come from?
So I always knew that I wanted to be a teacher. When I say always, I think I was maybe 12, something like that. I was very young when I decided that this was the route for me. And I think, like most people, I had many experiences. Most of my formative experiences as a child were in the classroom. I think that might be true for many folks. And I wanted to have a life that was about that kind of nurturing connection. Not to be too soft and mushy about it, but I love the way that teachers metaphorically are these gardeners who get to tend and they get to cultivate and bring something into being that didn't exist, and it comes about through their care. And there's other things that I've discovered along the way, but I think intuitively as a child, I was able to understand before I really could articulate it fully that was the kind of life that I wanted to lead. And I think that is a large part of what attracted me to education. And plus, I think there was an episode of Saved by the Bell, the college years, where they had this professor that was really cool. And I just thought, wow, he was like the professor with long hair and jeans. And I was like, you know what? I want to be, I want to be a cool teacher one day. Teachers are cool. I don't care what anybody thinks. So it was things like that. So even as young as maybe 12 or so, when I was in middle school, I think is when I figured it out. And then high school, I said, yeah, I think this is still what I want to do. Went into college and studied education. And now I've, as I said in the bio, as you said in the bio, it's been 19 years now. Started teaching in 2004, and that was actually after a year of teaching abroad. And it's my life's work. I love it. And it's a very rewarding path.
The reason I started there was because, as you heard me say, I am a co-laborer in education as well. I'm in that field also. But I took a detour to get there, even though it was my first love and my first passion. I took a detour, after a conversation with my dad in terms of the money that could be made, business versus education, ultimately wound up back in education. Where I'm going with this is right now, and I'm sure New York is no different from New Jersey, we are literally suffering from a teacher shortage. A lot of people are not going into the field. And then whenever we start breaking it down in terms of African Americans who are going into the field, it gets even less. And then when you say African American males, the number gets even less. So I'm intrigued because education, I've been working and educating children in one form or another since I was a kid. I was an organist at my church, choir director, so forth and so on. Worked with kids when I was a kid. Always worked in various camps and, always education related. And then wound up doing my undergrad degree in business, and I worked in corporate. But I salute you as an African-American male who made that decision early on that I want to be a teacher, because I tell folks all the time, Bijoun, I don't think there's any other industry, at least at best, it may equal, it won't surpass it, where you get to leave a legacy other than in education. And as a black man, I guarantee you, your students will not forget you. I don't care if they live to be 100 years old. They're always going to remember Mr. Jordan. So in terms of, okay, you're a black male, you're an educator. I mean, what was your actual major in college? Was it education or was it English?
So it was a combination. It was both. So what my, degree on my wall, or as people say, my receipt on the wall says is secondary English education. So it was a combination of both.
And see, the reason I asked that is because when I did convert, or whenever I did go alternate route and I moved from corporate to education, I was an 8th grade language arts teacher. Okay. I've always been an avid reader as a child, all the way. I've been still an avid reader. And so it was a natural fit that whenever I left corporate to go into education, that I would teach language arts, because that's my area: communications, language arts, public speaking, so forth and so on. But again, in terms of role modeling, and because our numbers are so few, I applaud you, because our kids need to see us in these classrooms.
Yeah, 100%. And as you shared about the unfortunate current statistics of what it looks like, I think the number is something like 2% black male teachers in the country. That's the number the statistic that I remember hearing, something like that. I know me personally, I never from K to 12, I never had a black male teacher. Yeah, not even one. I had, the closest I came, no offense to phys ed, right? I had a black male phys ed teacher in middle school. I had Miss Strozier. Shout out to my 2nd grade teacher. I don't know where she is right now. She was a black woman teacher. That was great. And I had a few other black women teachers. But in my entire education, I never had a black male teacher. So that's just another layer of privilege and honor, added to it. And absolutely. And also, as you said as well, in terms of modeling what it is to lead the life of an intellectual, I think that's one of the beautiful things about our profession, is that we get to be that kind of role model for students. The impact that we have on them, but also showing them this is what it's like to be an educated citizen. This is what it's like to lead that life of thought and everything that involves. So that's really cool too, and that's tricky too, because another thought I was having as you were sharing is that one of my secondary goals, number one goal, of course, is just making sure students succeed and that they enjoy what they're learning in your class. But also too, I want to teach kids to love reading.
Absolutely.
That's really hard, especially I teach at the high school level. So, I teach mostly 11th and 12th grade. And by that time, it's a little tricky. I'm almost like, I'm almost like that final last stand or something, like, as long as I can get one kid in my senior class to just say, oh my God, this was so amazing. I don't know. And of course I've been able to achieve that, but sometimes, right? But really would love to do that at a higher level and to do more of it.
No, in terms of reading, I just told you I was an avid reader. I've been reading since I was a small child, and I still read voraciously. In my view, and I could be biased, but I don't think so, reading and comprehending is the foundation for everything else. Now, I'm not throwing shade on any other subject, but I'm just saying, in order to do the rest of the subjects, you need to be able to read and comprehend. And we are in a more reading-intensive time than probably we've ever been. I mean, everything, if you can't read and to follow instructions and so forth and so on, my heart goes out to you. I use this example all the time. I've been behind folks at an automated teller machine. We know it as ATM. who could not read. And the ATMs are getting more and more sophisticated and complicated in terms of options and offers, advertisements, and everything that it keeps throwing at you. I've seen folks who could not read ultimately give up, pull their card out. Now, think about that. Somebody couldn't get their money because they didn't know how to read the directions coming out of the machine.
Right. That's a very, very basic life function. Right. Yeah. Yeah.
So I join you in terms of the passion for reading. Now, this is kind of where it gets tricky in terms of going back to race again, because I'm going to work my way up to your contribution in the book.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
You know and probably have heard the adage, just like I have, or the cliche, or the whatever they want to call it, that if you ever want to hide anything from black people, put it in a book.
Right.
That was a way of saying they don't read. They don't like to read. They can't read. They don't want to. And you also know, historically, for those of us back in slavery times, we could get killed for learning how to read, as well as the person teaching you how to read could get killed.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So how do we now, as black men, help people of color, brown kids, black kids, understand, and really, like you just said, when they get to you at 11th and 12th grade, they're at the last stand. And so how do we get them to understand and appreciate the value of reading?
Yes. I think the goal is challenging, but the methods are simple. I hope anyway, right? It really is just through exposing students to rich curriculum. If you can create enough rich, relevant curriculum, right? If you can create enough moments in your classroom and in your time and in your experience with students where they discover something really important, or they are able to discover themselves through literature, that's going to begin to click and connect more and more. You can't make kids want to read or like to read, but I think we can teach our children the importance and the relevance of reading and literature, and reminding them too. There was a moment where I thought you were going to go with this, where it is very reading intensive now, and part of how our lives are still so text rich is through social media. And sometimes, a teenager is reading the same amount of text that I'm reading, or that an adult who, I'll take my wife for an example. She's one of the most avid readers that I know. She's reading voraciously, and she probably reads half a novel every single day worth of text, right? So sometimes our young people are reading close to that, but they're consuming it more through social media. So I think that's something that's important to keep in mind, and also to make explicit for children too. Y'all are reading all the time. Look, I'm just giving it to you perhaps in a little bit of a different format. And there are ways that as teachers that we have to adapt and modify and meet children where they are. I think that if we do that consistently, rigorously, thoroughly, with care, it's an invitation. We have 180 days from September to June, as it is, here in New York City. I know it's August to May and many other places, right? So that's how much runway I have, and I just want to create many, many rich exposures and experiences with text. So when you shared about the history of why it is that, to whatever degree the stereotype is true, no stereotype is 100% true. There's a history and a legacy between why there's a gap between us and literature, right? So one of my favorite books to teach, I had the chance to teach Kindred, and I taught that. Most recently, I taught that in the fall of 2021. And my students, who I actually got to teach those same students this year too. They kept going back to it. They kept bringing, this reminds me of this in Kindred. Oh, Kindred was such a fantastic, amazing book. And one of the things that I love about Kindred by Octavia Butler, for anybody who doesn't know, is how she really shows in the text how the institution of slavery operated. And she also does some really deep things to connect the impact and the effects of slavery on the present. I know we'll come back to that too with the things we're talking about today. But also one very specific thing that she shows that you can't take for granted that kids know walking into your classroom is the consequences of literacy. And there's a character who teaches someone to read. She takes this amazingly bright, brilliant young child who's illiterate and has no access to that information, and she opens up this world for him. And then we see the consequences on that character of that. Essentially, her life is put in danger. And so our kids were able to discover that. And I love specifically about English that in English class, I can teach my kids about anything. I have a group of students this year who were able to learn a little bit about this. Is something that just happened. There's a guy whose nickname is Dr. Deep Sea, Joseph Daturi, and he's researching the effects of living in a high barometric pressure environment underwater. He lived underwater for over 100 days. He just came up maybe a couple of weeks ago. He lived in an environment underwater. And so it's like anything, the random stuff, anything can come into my classroom, and I love that. And I use that privilege and that opportunity to make sure that students also learn about their history. And they can do it creatively when you pick the right book. English is the subject of ideas, and that just, that lights me up.
Well, you bring up an excellent point in terms of, in many instances, it's not necessarily that they don't like to read or want to read. It's just a matter of what they choose to read. And like you said, so if it's reading text messages or reading Facebook posts or Instagram posts or now threads or whatever you want to call it, they are reading. So it's a matter of choice. But at the same time, in terms of now getting into the higher level and vocabulary and being able to move beyond just the everyday words that you see in a text message, that's the challenge we have of getting our kids. And you hit the nail right on the head when you just said curriculum and something that they're interested in and making it come to life. That is the trick, and is going to lead us into the discussion of Illmatic, because as we know, if you've been following the news and anybody in current events, books are being banned. Like you were just talking curriculum and the opportunity to be autonomous and teach pretty much what you want. That right now, there are some serious efforts for that to be done away with. That you would not be able to teach kindred. If there are some folks that had their way, you would not be able to teach kindred.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I've seen that text listed. And you're reminding me, so some of this, and I do have to say, the caveat on this one, I do teach in New York City and Brooklyn, more specifically in New York State, of course. So it's a little bit different here, state by state by state. That's how, our education system works and how it works legally and everything, really about the state or the district that you teach in. But through social media, I'm networked with teachers that I see sharing a lot of very, really just disheartening and disturbing posts and information and news about what it's like in their state or in their district. I saw there was an exchange that I saw between AP Lit teachers. I teach the AP Lit course at my high school, and I'm in a group with other AP Lit teachers. Actually 13,000 of them. So they're sharing all different kinds of perspectives. But one very common that I never used to hear that I've started hearing specifically in the last 2 years, and we know why, right? Kind of the anti-CRT moment that we live in. And the teachers are sharing how, there's one person in particular, they shared how they're in Florida, and it literally has gone to the point where, I don't know what district it was, but it has gone to the point where all of the literature that they teach, there's a pre-approved list. So the district literally has a list of, you can teach this, anything that's not on this list, you cannot bring that into your curriculum. I'm talking texts, right? You cannot bring these texts into your curriculum, which is, I'm thinking of that when I was in school, something like that would be absolutely unimaginable.
Correct.
Something like that and it still kind of boggles my mind. And I think about the freedom that I have enjoyed with curriculum in the schools that I've worked in, where it's the opposite for me. I can choose literally any text. And as a responsible educator, I'm not going to choose something that's irrelevant or inappropriate. But I've never had problems or pushback, both for good reasons and bad. I mean, sometimes it's because parents might not necessarily know what their kids are reading. But the fact that I've never had any kind of pushback it just makes me appreciate that all the more. But it makes me fear all the more for that other side of this country, of the United States. The sometimes divided states of America, where if you're a teacher in a classroom, it's pre-approved. You get this, you don't get that, that's it, take it or leave it. That's the deal. And what about books that should be on that list and are not? And but that's happening. That's where we are right now.
It is. And that's where I hear exactly what you're saying in terms of it's not in New York right now. And the emphasis is on the word now, because this thing can spread like a contagion. It may be Florida and Texas today, but that's not to say it won't work its way through the East Coast, the Midwest, and the West. Before you know it, we got all 50 states that are doing what Florida and Texas are doing. So it can be a contagion. That's why a book like what you're a contributor to is so important. The Illmatic Consequences, the Clapback. of opponents of critical race theory. So I have one question from the listening audience. Listening audience, if you want to text me a question to ask Bijoun, you can text it to 973-720-2738. You can text that number just like you do any other phone number. I have a question that came up on that. It says, what do you or Bijoun think would prompt more black males to go into education? That's the question that came through from a listener. And again, listening audience, you can text your questions to me at 973-720-2738. Text it there, and I will see it just like I just saw the question that came up. So, Bijoun, what do you think will prompt more black males to go into education?
Yeah, no problem. So I have at least two ideas that initially come to mind, and then I can sit down and form a committee. But so, one thing, of course, is representation. And representation really does matter. And I think that we're beginning to see more and more representation and valuing of the career of education, and specifically people of color being involved in joining in education. I think that's one thing. So like even this moment right now, just to tip my hat to you very briefly, right? So the show that you have, and choosing to have, I'm not primarily a writer. You know what I mean? That's something I'm able to do, of course, thanks to my teachers and my own effort. But this is a moment right now where we're putting a spotlight on education and on the importance of education in this whole show, right? With the controversy with CRT and also with me as a black male educator. So There's somebody listening to this right now who's going to hear it right now, or maybe they'll hear it later. And they'll perhaps give a second thought to, maybe they should watch Saved by the Bell, the college years, to see why teachers are cool. Or hearing from me that might spark or inspire something. So representation. And of course, the students and exposure, I think is closely connected with that as well. I know, students that I've taught in my years who have gone on to become educators themselves. And it's, of course, extremely fulfilling and touching to see that. I have not seen as many black males. I have to think more about how to engage them. But I'll move on to the second little idea that I have right now, which is initiatives. So, one of the things that New York City has done a pretty good job of is having large-scale public initiatives that create specific incentives and advantages for people to join the career. And they do this in a way that, through the messaging and the imaging and through the approach, is race conscious. And I am somebody who definitely believes in. Here we are now in a world where, the Supreme Court, as of last week, right? This is last week in America, the Supreme Court has ruled against affirmative action.
Correct.
Universities, right? So that's a whole thing, and thank you for addressing that last week on your show. I listened. But race-conscious initiatives, at least initiatives, right? But even more helpfully so. Put it in the image, and most importantly, put it in the policies, put it in the incentives. So I don't have any policies that are on my mind at the exact moment, but some examples that I've seen from the past, giving people loan forgiveness, right? There's a lot of loan
Absolutely.
Programs. And we know that programs like this have a disproportionate impact, where sometimes you can't necessarily, you don't always have to make it explicitly race conscious, but we know that's going to lift certain boats a little higher than others, and for people who really need that kind of relief and that kind of assistance. So I think that there have to be programs and campaigns, and more districts need to do that.
I cannot agree with you more. Matter of fact, I'm back in school now, and I'm going to be seeking debt forgiveness if possible. I don't know if they're going to do it, but in terms of, I've been doing this now 23 years, and it's been in an urban area. So the worst they can say is no, and I'll still be in the same predicament I'm in now. But you're absolutely right. I don't know if those of you who are familiar with the show Abbott Elementary, but they're doing a big push. It's particularly Tyler James Williams. He's doing a big push on getting the word out there. As a matter of fact, I just posted something yesterday on my social media sites where him and two other people are in T-shirts that say "Black teachers needed," or "We need black teachers," or something like that. I have to pull it up to see the exact words. But the cast of Abbott Elementary is doing exactly what you're saying to get the word out in terms of trying to encourage people to get in that field. It is so important because we're in front of kids every day that need to see folks who look like them to say, I want to be like Mr. Jordan. I want to be like Mr. Medley. We need those folks in front of them for them to be able to say, that's who I want to be like. And if it's never seen, because I'm big on exposure. The school that I run, I try to expose my boys to anything and everything going so they understand they have options. They all want to go to the NFL, the NBA, MLB, soccer, so forth and so on. And I'm like, God bless you if you get there. Just remember me if you get there. But, the chances of you getting there is very slim. You need to be able to do something else. So it's interesting that I heard you say that you don't consider yourself a writer, because that's one of the questions I usually ask, particularly to my authors, is turn like, well, when did the love or the interest in writing begin? And you just kind of said you don't consider yourself a writer, even though, you teach English. So with that being said, we're now going on into the book. And what I want you to do is, before we even go into this, is talk to me a little bit about, because everybody in the listening audience is not familiar with what critical race theory is. So each time that I have one of you on, I want you to give me your definition or the definition of critical race theory, just to bring the listening audience up to speed as to what it is we're actually talking about. So talk to me a little bit about, in your view or in your definition of what you feel critical race theory is, and then we'll talk in terms of your contribution to the book.
Mm-hmm. Just quickly, a clarification. I'm not primarily or professionally a writer, right?
Correct.
Professionally, I'm an educator. I suppose I was being a little bit extra humble at that moment. Yeah. So, but I do want to answer that question that you mentioned as well. So what lit me up and inspired me in terms of being a writer? One particular moment was, it's the first semester of college, and I kind of, snuck my way into a class that was actually not supposed to be for freshmen. It was supposed to be for sophomores and above, and I was able to talk my way into the class. I knew how to do that back then. So this was a poetry class. It was a creative writing class, rather, and that focused on poetry. And I think it might have been the first day, second lesson, something like that. I had never heard of the poet Rainer Maria Rilke. And, we got a book from him, and it's like, okay, read this whole book. So I'm riding the bus back to Patterson, and I'm reading this book, and I come across one of the things that he wrote about was that to be a writer, you must write or you will die. Like you will cease to exist. If you are a writer, then it is you must write. You cannot not write. It's almost like not breathing. I forget the exact way that he put it, but the urgency of it. And at the time, I was puzzled by that, but I started to see a little something for myself, and I started writing more. This class, I had to write now. And I was never a poet before, but all of a sudden I had to become a poet for this class, and I put together whatever. And I discovered more of a passion and an enjoyment. I've always been an appreciator. I've always been somebody who can look at a great text and say, oh, that's great. But then I became more of somebody who, I want to create something that's going to make that impact on somebody else. Well, at least for me, that I can look at it and be like, oh, that's dope, So I started to do that there. I experimented with writing rap lyrics. I started doing that for the first time when I was maybe about 20 or so. And then that carried through I had maybe 10 years of writing pretty frequently. And then, like I said, I'm a recovering lyricism addict. I don't really write rap anymore. I stopped writing poetry. No, I write poetry sometimes. That's a lie. So I just wanted to address that. So and grad school will do it, man. I mean, and undergrad.
Yes, it will.
This is one of the things that I tell my students this all the time. I want to make sure they understand. In college, it's going to be you and an essay, and that's it. That's the primary way that you will be assessed, right? Midterm, 5-pager. Final exam, 10-pager. Rinse, wash, repeat. That's what it's going to be, and you're going to do a few of those every term. So this 2-page essay that you're whining and complaining about, listen, I need you to know this is a middle step.
Correct.
Between where you're going to need to be in a very short amount of time. Like I said, I had the privilege of teaching seniors this year. I actually was able to teach the whole senior class at my school. It's the first time in my career I had that privilege. I loved it. And, I really wanted to drive this home with them too. Look, in September, in August, right?
That's
what it's
right.
going to be. And to make sure they understand as well, this is what class looks like. It's not you come in and you sit and you fight to pay attention for 40 minutes. That's not what class looks like. You come into the class and you start talking.
That's correct.
You come in and you bring your own ideas. That's what class looks like in college, and you need to be prepared for that. You have to have your own ideas. It's not going to be somebody guiding and leading you in the same kinds of ways. There has to be a higher level of independence with that. And something I started doing this year as well is really focusing much more on when it comes time for us to write an essay. I want your idea. I'm not going to ask you here are the 6 options for what you can write about in your essay. No. I want you to watch what you see in the text.
Correct.
Then we come to the end of it. You tell me what you observed and what you noticed, and we'll go back and I'll help you put it all together. So I say all of that to say, when I was in that seat, undergrad, grad, and I found myself writing things that I didn't know that I could write. The highest of this, of course. So I was able to obtain a master's while I was teaching, and my thesis, for example, which kicked my butt. But and it ended up it was delayed. I didn't finish it on time. But at the end of it, I had this 43-page document.
Correct.
I wrote. I did every word of it. I did however many dozens or even hundreds of hours of research. And there it was, and I created that, and I'm proud of it. And I have a copy of it on the desk upstairs, what I'm saying, like right now. So that is a long answer to your question of me discovering a love for writing. And that's something that, as much as I can, I really want to give that away, to the students that I teach now. So
your description of college was spot on in terms of essays and so forth and so, because that's me. I just started in June. My first class is starting. That's all we've been doing is analyzing YouTube videos, speeches, writing essays. Matter of fact, I'm putting the finishing touches on the essay I'm doing now by Adam Clayton Powell. And but that's analyzing leadership styles, so forth and so forth. You're right, and and exactly what you said is exactly what the professor said. We don't necessarily need you to describe the video or describe the essay, or we want you to give us your thoughts, and we want you to analyze it. Yeah. And give it. So you're spot on. So that leads me to, okay, how did you? And matter of fact, I'm gonna talk to me about critical race theory, because that was the second part of the question. Your definition or the definition of critical race theory.
Basically, critical race theory boils down to this. We cannot pretend that the history and legacy of slavery and race in the United States is totally separate from the institutions that we build in the United States. I think that's what critical race theory boils down to. And I am not a CRT scholar, but I've read from the scholars and whatever. I think that's how you really boil it down. You can't separate that. So it's like saying, if you're raised in a home where it's kind of like the foundation of the home that you're raised in, that's going to affect the person you become. It just will. Like, you can't, how can it not, right? It would be like if you're raised in a country where everybody's speaking French, you're going to speak French.
Correct.
So there's this thing that we do with race particularly. Actually, the first thing, and this is one of my personal gripes, and I got to say this, and when the CRT controversy came along, this was one of the things that I was most passionate about it. Race is the only problem in our society where people propose that the solution is to stop talking about it.
Now, it's funny you bring that, because I had that highlighted and underlined in your chapter. That's the first thing I highlighted on it. Race is the one issue we are somehow supposed to address by not talking about it. How
insane is that as a problem-solving method? And, of course, we're smart enough to figure out why, right? Nobody wants to be the villain in their own story. And in the story of our country's history, unfortunately, when it comes to race, people of European descent, they played the villain.
Correct.
That's a super generalization. But I can understand why when I was a kid, 13, 14, 15, 16, sitting in class, and when race came up, I felt uncomfortable and I felt ashamed, and I would look at the other black kids in the room and check their faces and see how they felt, and I would look at the white kids and I would see them squirm, and I was fortunate enough to go to school that had a pretty good racial diversity, but it's like we have to contend with that, we have to deal with that, we have to address it, and part of the reason that we've learned to react these ways with either shame or fear or guilt, all of these kind of things, is because we're so lacking and so far behind in terms of what education around racism and race looks like in our country. We don't have a structure for that. I was so lucky. I have to shout out officially my favorite college professor, Aliyah Abdur Rahman. I went to NYU, and she was one of my professors there, and just the best class I ever had, where we read the best kind. It's kind of like, this is what I'm trying to do as a teacher now to some extent. Recreate the experience that she was able to give us in college, right? And she was hitting us with stuff that to me seems kind of normal, and it's all part of a racial or a curriculum that addresses race now. But at the time, I was like, oh, what's that? Oh, what's this? Oh, what's it? You know, so many things that were so new. And one of the things that she introduced to us, she brought in a black, white, and red text one day, this nice little slim book, and put it in front of us, and it said on the cover, Critical Race Theory. And I had never heard of this before. I had never encountered it before. This would have been about 2002, probably 2001, 2002. And then began to read the text, and it just made so much sense. Everything just fit together. I think it was a really great articulation of how, through a legal framework, race operates in this country. And it was great to receive that. But I learned in that class something that I had never realized before, which is that we are really crappy as a country about teaching about race, which
correct
is so important in our society and in our culture. And we're in this moment of backlash now where people who are trying to create more conscious, more aware curricula that are going to help prepare everyone for what the reality of race is, there's such a backlash now, and those people are now being vilified in a certain way. And the whole, I mean, again, it's that same philosophy of suppression and
correct.
The way that we need to deal about, no, it's going to ruffle too many feathers. It's going to make too many people feel sad. It's going to make, so we have to take it out and address it in this way. Let's do the cartoon version, right? And that's what we're getting. And it's really sad and shameful to see, because it's going to completely destroy and stifle the progress that we need to make as a country. And we keep seeing over and over again where we have so many incidents that take place where we're those of us with a certain level of awareness realize this education is really so needed.
Correct. Matter of fact, listening audience, I hope you've been with me since 6, but I certainly hope you've been with me since 7, because my guest this morning is Bijoun Eric Jordan, and we're actually discussing his contribution to the book Illmatic Consequences, the Clapback to Opponents of Critical Race Theory. That book is published by Universal Right Publications, LLC. If you want to find out more about it, go to the website www.uwpbooks.com. But I'm going to read from the back of the book, and then we're going to talk about Bijoun's contribution. He's actually Chapter 9, Static, the Illmatic Consequences of the Critical Race Theory Boogeyman. So we're going to talk about that boogeyman in a minute, but I'm going to read from the back of the book. The genesis of critical race theory, CRT, did not derive from Fox News or conservative hot takes from right-wing media. In this text, scholars and activists come together to clap back on the lies that animated attacks at local school boards in January 6, 2021 insurrection at the U.S. Capitol. Like a hip-hop DJ, CRT samples radical histories predating slavery and the Middle Passage before the point of no return, quote-unquote, and remixes these moments to better understand our present time. Editors Walter Greason and Danian Jerry lift the evidence and perspectives provided by emerging leaders to cut through the white noise defining CRT and dismantling the falsehoods promoted by its opponents. Comparable to Nas's iconic Illmatic Consequences, disrupts traditional nonfiction writing by designing the text like a hip-hop concert album by blending African-American orality and written traditions. Illmatic Consequences explains CRT, its purpose, and why black and white students can benefit from the scholarship. Inspired by the work of David Roediger, Eduardo Bonilla Silva, Nicole Hannah-Jones, Ibram Kendi, and Carol Anderson, Illmatic Consequences stretches the vision and lexicon of Nasir Jones to a new generation of artists. Stacey Robinson's surrealist depictions of these sonic legacies has already inspired the worldwide expansion of the black speculative arts movement. Readers of this text will become the vanguard of a global society dedicated to freedom, justice, and decolonization. So, Bijoun, how did you get involved with this project? Because, like I said, you're Chapter 9, Static, the Illmatic Consequences of the Critical Race Theory Boogeyman. How did you get involved with the project? And then talk to me about where the concept come up about the boogeyman.
Sure. Well, I want to thank the algorithm for that, our beloved algorithm. So I was scrolling on Facebook, man. So that's, my number one social medium is Facebook. I'm scrolling and I see this post. I see a picture of Nas, holding a microphone, and he's in the pose. I can tell that the image was recomposed from the album cover for his, I think it was 2001 album, Illmatic, right? There's a certain, anybody who's seen that album cover will know, like, the Nas pose that I'm talking about. And it was a call for essays, and I'm like, okay, what's this about? I check out the description, so it's very simple. So they were just using the concept of Illmatic to inspire their approach to scholarship around this particular issue of the anti-CRT movement. And I just knew in that instant, oh, this is for me. I got to write this. I can't remember the last time I wrote an essay, but, I'm going to write this bad boy. So I had actually done a few personal responses to the CRT controversy. The first thing that I did was my Halloween costume in 2021 I was the CRT boogeyman. I don't know how this concept landed on me, but I looked at the way that CRT was being treated, and it was very clear that it was like, it's something that's it was this kind of deceptive, distorted perception of CRT. Fortunately, again, thanks to the professors that I had, the one that I mentioned, I actually had been exposed to CRT, which is, I have to make this point, CRT is an obscure legal theory that came about in the late 70s and the early 80s, and it never really, it never became anything super huge. And then I was really fortunate to even have heard about it at all in college, and that was the only time I ever heard about it. Now, all of a sudden, people are talking about CRT, and I'm hearing it out of the mouths of conservatives, and I'm like, no, this doesn't feel right. This is suspect. And essentially, as I argue in the essay that I wrote, I trace the history as far as I've been able to mine it and discover it of how this distortion campaign was created around CRT. But back to Halloween 2021. So I bought like a boogeyman kind of suit. It was a black, suit that covered my whole body, and it had these glowing light up eyes, and I painted CRT with red and white letters on my chest, just looking at white letters with red gore and blood at the bottom of the letters. And everybody got it and understood the whole concept behind it. And then fast forward to the following year, and I see this call for essays, and I'm like, yeah, this is okay. Let me respond fully. Let me say all the stuff I got to say. So that was how I got involved with that. And could you repeat the second part of your question?
No, it's just that we're going to actually get into your essay.
Yeah, cool.
We're going to actually get into it, which you kind of gave us the concept of where the boogeyman came from. And I'm reading you through there, and you're absolutely right. There's some parts that I highlighted, and I'll tell you the first line I highlighted was one that you just talked about. But it says, I'm going here, and again, I want you to kind of give a summary of it, because one, we want folks to get the book, and certainly, you're, like I said, you're chapter 9. But it says, CRT's detractors have benefited from its obscurity and seized on the chance to interpret it as they see fit. And their misinterpretations have set the terms of discussion. You also, I had here, the American Bar Association defines critical race theory as a practice of interrogating the role of race and racism in society, with its roots in legal scholarship and with the purpose of critiquing how the social construction of race and institutionalized racism perpetuate a racial caste system that relegates people of color to the bottom tiers. And there's some other areas I highlight as well, but again, give me your thoughts in terms, because there was another line that jumped out at me in terms of, we're not trying to suppress the story of the Holocaust. We're not trying to suppress book. Certainly, I know when I was teaching 8th grade language arts, a required text by the end of the year was the Diary of Anne Frank. I don't see any efforts to do away with that. So, let's talk a little bit about your chapter.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for pulling all those points out and highlighting all of those. Yes. All right. So my approach in the essay, when I saw the framework through which they were approaching the collection, it made sense to actually reference Nas as my inroad. So the way that I structure my argument, in fact, is by taking a number of quotes from Nas's Illmatic. And part of my process of preparing to write the essay was listening through Illmatic several times and studying the lyrics newly, right? Taking a fresh look at it. And one of the lyrics that stood out to me the most, and I'll quote it for you now, is, "Time is Illmatic, keep static like wool fabric. Pack the formatic to crack your whole cabbage. So I'm going to break that down, right? And, that comes from the song Life's a Bee. I won't say the word, but, time is Illmatic. Keep static like wool fabric. Pack the formatic to crack your whole cabbage. So let me try to give like a one-page summary. So first of all, Nas has described Illmatic as, the illest of the ill, beyond ill, right? And actually, I never knew this until this week when I was doing some more, preparation for this interview. So I didn't know that the name Illmatic actually came from someone that Nas knew himself, who was incarcerated. And he took that name and interpreted it to mean, the illest of the ill. So him calling his him calling his album Illmatic was, declaring this album is going to be the illest of the ill. But he uses it somewhat differently here. Time is Illmatic, keep static like wool fabric. So the events so time, like history, right? The historical timeline, the events that take place, there's a buildup of static that happens there, and time holds on to that static, like wool fabric holds on to static that's on our clothes. And he clarifies that this kind of static is related to incidents of violence, right? So pack the formatic, right? So that's an automatic, weapon to crack your whole cabbage. And for anybody who doesn't know, non-hip-hop fans, your cabbage is your head. So to crack your whole cabbage, you can get, metaphorically speaking, shot in the head, or even literally, right, because of what he's describing in his album. So I used that quote as my inroad, and that particular part about the keep static like wool fabric. So what I did, or what I argue, is that the historic timeline of the United States essentially is like that wool fabric that holds on to static, that builds up due to unresolved issues, due to racism, due to issues of oppression, due to injustice, violence, these issues that have taken place. And it's this unreleased static that sometimes, if you build up enough static, eventually there's going to be a discharge somewhere, right? You're going to come close enough to it and pop. It's going to be a discharge.
Correct.
And I use that metaphorically as some of the incidents that we see that take place are like discharges of the static that has built up in the historical fabric of our nation. So January 6th, the attempted insurrection, right? Or, that is an example of a kind of a discharge of this static. But I also clarify that what is really causing all of this is the distorted way in which we view our history and our past, and the way in which we, collectively, not me, I'm not one of these people, but the way that we collectively as a society have refused to directly encounter and engage and acknowledge what took place.
Correct.
That's how I approach the topic, right? And the other big piece that when I started looking and reading up on what took place. Oh, another thing, an article that just kind of fell in my lap one day was actually, there's a particular person who really started all of this anti-CRT stuff. There's actually one person who really was the architect or the orchestrator of this disinformation campaign that we are now 3 years into. And so I was able to find some information on this dude. And, to just briefly summarize. And for me at the time, it just, I still am like, we're a nation of 300 million. And to look at the manipulative, propagandistic power that, one person or a small group of people can have to just really shift how people perceive the truth and all the impact. And, you look at what all this that has happened in the last few years, it's frightening to me just how powerfully distortion and propaganda still work today, maybe even more powerfully and quickly today. And the entire, there's been, so something else that I found is there have been 563 pieces of legislation that have been either proposed or enacted in 49 states, basically the whole country, right? This is from September of 2020 through December of 2022. So I found UCLA did this. They're doing a project called Tracking the Attack on Critical Race Theory. And so they identified 563 instances of anti-CRT measures. This is state governments. This is local governments. This is during that 2 year and 3 month time span span of time. They're tracking this year now, and unfortunately, this year is on pace still. So I'll take it back to the guy who started all this stuff. So this guy named Christopher Rufo.
Interesting you bring him up, because again, that's another highlighted section. That's where he was on Tucker Carlson, and he actually said it was a threat to the country.
Yes. Yeah. So yeah, the timeline of it, right? Christopher Rufo. There's racial sensitivity workshops going on. The context is 2020, right? This is an incredible summer where, unfortunately at great human cost, at great cost of lives and well-being and suffering, right? We know George Floyd, right? We know Breonna Taylor, right? We know several other individuals who unfortunately were lost during this time. But we were in this moment now, this inflection point where there was a new level of social engagement. Black Lives Matter really took off, right? Black Lives Matter has been around since 2012, but 2020, and I break the numbers down, the evidence, the proof, right? I really break it down in the essay of how Black Lives Matter really blew up this year. And there were certain key changes. For example, the diversity of the Black Lives Matter protests was at a level that was never before seen. Other people were starting to get it, and I hate to sound conspiratorial in it, but people on the, conservatives and people on the right wing, they, to some degree, must have been able to detect that. And there had to be some kind of clapback. There had to be some kind of backlash. We've seen it ever since, the Civil War and Reconstruction that took place after. Every time there's progress, there's always a backlash. So, 2020, racial sensitivity workshops were increasing and proliferating. There were many, many more, and there seemed to be an authentic effort at this time to really deal with these issues of race and racism. There were some documents from anti-bias training that got leaked. And so Christopher Rufo, at this time, he's a guy who's working for the Manhattan Institute, or, he's still a guy today. But right, so Christopher Rufo, he's a guy who's working for the Manhattan Institute. Somebody's like, I found these documents of what's going on in these anti-bias trainings. And they leak some of these documents to Christopher Rufo. Christopher Rufo starts doing his due diligence. He starts doing research and stuff. He starts reading back through the sources and the figures whose thought was used to create this. Eventually, he lands on CRT, critical race theory, right? And he finds in that, and these are his words, the perfect villain. He sees the perfect villain here. And he, for example, noticed that those three words, critical race theory, those are all words that he can exploit the negative connotations that those words have for the American public in general. And as you said, he goes on Tucker Carlson's show. This is September. Was it? Well, I know it's 2020. I believe it was September of 2020. And within 6 days of him going on Tucker Carlson's show, we have Donald Trump's executive order 13950, which that was crazy for me. I had never really seen an executive order like that. But essentially, with the executive order, just to give the ridiculously short summary, this executive order is now banning certain practices in racial sensitivity trainings and workshops. So this is now from the very top of the federal government trying to dictate what kind of coursework and what kind of ideas can be pushed out and put forward in racial sensitivity trainings. And the more that I read the document, because I said, let me read the actual executive order instead of just the articles, what they're saying in their summary. So I read through the whole thing, and what struck me and also aggravated me and infuriated me to an extent was the level of distortion that I was seeing in how, and how some of these ideas and philosophies, these anti-racist ideas, are being described. For example, one of the things that the executive order outlaws is the idea that people are inherently bad or evil because of their race. Like, that's not part of what anti-racism training is really about or what it's really trying to convey. Mind you, this executive order does not mention critical race theory. Why? Because now we see down the line critical race theory had to be created as a buzzword. If you look at the use of the word in the media in 2020, it's a flat line. There's nothing. You look at 2021, you couldn't escape the term critical race theory or CRT, and it's blowing up school boards. And just the main thing that I want people to take away from the essay is an understanding of, and I can't do all the detail here, of course, but in the essay of like how this was all crafted. This is a crafted campaign of manipulation. And you hear people's words where they're basically admitting and confessing that. They know that they're doing a shine job on everybody. And it's just really disappointing to see the effects of it to this very day. I know that I want to share something disturbing that my aunt sent some way, just because I think it really characterizes just how backward things are getting.
Oh, go ahead.
Okay, so there's, I just want to, there's an exact quote that I took down from this person. Okay, so there's a clip my aunt forwards it to me. You know, that's how we communicate nowadays, right? It's messages,
correct,
messages on Instagram and the rest, right?
Correct.
So, the person appearing in the clip is Mike Keller, and he's a guest speaker at it's called Fair Park Baptist Church. You know, he's speaking to the congregation. And he says, and I want to emphasize this is an exact quote. He says, "Folks, I want to tell you, it is really simple. I'll show you how to change America." And then he goes on to say, 150 years ago or 200 years ago, when the blacks were slaves, did they ever go to Washington, D.C. and have a rally 200 years ago to protest against slavery? Did they? No. What did they do? Well, a lot of good people in the, you know, he kind of stutters here and says, plantations would say, "Hey, it's wintertime. Let us help build a church for you, dear folks." And they loved them, and they taught them how to read so they could read the Bible. Here's what the blacks did about 150 years ago. They humbled themselves. They prayed. They sought God's face. And they turned from their wicked ways. And God made slavery illegal through several white presidents, right? It worked, didn't it? They didn't protest, right? The church later had to issue an apology. They basically said slavery and racism are wrong. We would never condone slavery or intolerance. They didn't address, or I didn't see anywhere where they addressed the outright lies and falsehood. Like when I had to watch that clip again, just like, did he really, like it's just a complete and total fabrication of what, you know, enslavement actually was like and how slavery was changed and how we you know, if you are growing up in this country thinking that the way that slavery changed was because of the benevolence of several white presidents, you know, as opposed to the actual, it literally took a civil war, right?
Correct.
For us to finally and to finally bring this, and of course there's 100 other things we have to mention about how slavery was intentionally enshrined in the fabric of our society. So I share this. Oh, and I have to add just very quickly. So it just so happens that this man, Mike Keller, he's the father of Anna Duggar, the famous Duggar family with the 19 or however many kids or whatever. And I was watching a documentary. Oh, the documentary is called Shiny Happy People. And one of the things that I got out of this documentary is how in their movement, in a certain part of the, you know, conservative evangelical movement, they use a lot of homeschooling, and I'm not trying to trash homeschooling. Homeschooling can be excellent, but the way that they do it, so it really is pretty much lies, you know, and fabrications and mythology with what they, you know, these certain individuals, what they teach their kids at home. But I also learned from the documentary just how, you know, virally, more or less, this particular brand of conservatism is spreading, and it's based on this mythology. And one of the things that the Duggar family and people like them who are in their kind of movement are really good at doing, they're really good at running for local office. And they're really good at finding a way to determine policy. And, you know, so I just want to connect the dots here a little bit. The anti-CRT movement is extremely threatening in the way that it threatens to destroy even the basic foundations of truth that our society is based on, and that we need to have a fully functioning society that can make progress, as opposed to continuing to abuse people who have already been abused. What's at stake right now is really truth itself, right? It's really truth itself. And so, you know, it's the old adage about, you know, the hunter versus the lion telling the story of the hunt. If the hunter is always going to glorify himself with the story of the hunt, you know. So
correct.
That is really what's at stake.
Again, I'm going to go back to your essay in terms of what I highlighted. There's a section here of what you were just talking about. It says, especially useful here are the mechanisms of propaganda. Quote, the language of democratic ideals takes on corrupted opposite meanings. Corrupt politicians run anti-corruption campaigns. Freedom of speech claims are used to suppress speech. And then when I go down on that same page, it says, through deception, manufactured panic, and even fascistic propaganda, conservatives have unleashed a new social specter, and along with it, the consequences in the fabric of time, which are truly Illmatic. For instance, the new debate over CRT is not merely a matter of public opinion. It is rapidly, and I underline these next words, reshaping the educational landscape. Lists of banned texts are proliferating. School board activists propose book burnings to purify our society. Political futures are being launched, with the most prominent example in 2021 being Glenn Youngkin getting elected to the governorship of Virginia, where education was suddenly among voters' top concerns, polling well above the ongoing pandemic. Just over a year ago, before the conjuring of the CRT boogeyman, it would have been abnormal for any political race, let alone a gubernatorial contest, to be so influenced by classroom practices. Now, this is my issue with book banning and suppressing of information. That is anti-education. Education is about learning new things and discovering facts and so forth and so on. All this banning of books and everything, really, to be honest with you, is anti-education.
Yeah.
So those areas that I just read, I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, it's like, no, we don't want the real history, because this is the thing. First off, under the guise of, oh, well, it's white bashing. No, it's not about white bashing. It's about telling the truth. Now, that's not saying someone who's white today have to feel guilty for what their forefathers did. Yeah. That's not what it's saying. But folks need to understand historically, this is what happened. And there, for lack of a better term, and I've seen it all over the place, little memes it's talking about, it's a pun, no pun intended. They're whitewashing history.
Yeah.
That's pretty much what's being done here, and it is important to have contributions like your essay, as well as books like Illmatic Consequences, the Clapback of opponents of critical race theory, because people need to understand really what's going on. I mean, the clocks are being set back. We talked about it last week with this whole thing with affirmative action. You can rest assured, because they started with the abortion rights, now it's affirmative action. You can rest assured what's coming down the pike is going to be the Civil Rights Act. Yeah. All of these things are being wiped back out. And again, none of them would have been necessary had folks been doing what they were supposed to do to begin with. So it's not as if, like you just said about these presidents. If you look, historically, even with Abraham Lincoln, that wasn't about his love for black people. Most of these moves have to do with economics, most of them.
Yeah.
Right? Has to do with...
And Lincoln was quite clear. He was clear.
Yes.
Listen, I know there are many quotes that can be found, but one that always stuck with me is that if he could end the Civil War without ending slavery, he would do so. He was quite clear about that.
Correct.
It really was about reunifying the country for him and what that symbolized and what that meant. It wasn't about freeing us. He said a whole number of racist things about us and what he actually thought about us. That wasn't what the issue was, but to hear them tell it. So, yeah.
No, absolutely. So, all right, we have now come down to the end. And interestingly enough, unbeknownst to Bijoun and I, we actually had a mutual acquaintance in terms of it being his aunt, and my friend had no idea that his aunt, and Janine has been on the show, that his aunt Janine Jordan was his aunt.
Yep.
And we just found that out whenever Bijoun agreed to do the show, and I put out the press release, and it made its way around, and Janine, lo and behold, called me and said, why didn't you tell me you were having my nephew on your show? And I said, because I didn't know I was having your nephew on my show.
Right. And she said to me, Bijoun, I was visiting her, and she said, just before I left, Bijoun, is there something you forgot to tell me?
That's what she told me.
No. What are we talking about here? I'm like, is this about to get serious? And then, so you going on the radio show? Oh yeah, it's this whole thing, and I wrote an essay, and la. Yeah. So Very small world that we're
extremely small world. And when I say extreme, I mean, again, I was sharing with somebody this morning. Actually, I was sharing with Io this morning. I want to hit a lottery that way because, I mean, statistically, and I've been in some statistical odds that are like, I've seen folks down in Disneyland or Disney World, whichever one that is in Florida, that I've run into folks from New Jersey down there. Neither one of us knew we were there. And as big as that park is, the chances of you actually running to each other is slim. And yet it happened. I mean, I've run it twice. It happened to me twice that I ran into people that I knew from New Jersey. We didn't know was down there. Just happened to be walking the park at the same time and ran into each other. All those people down there. So the same thing here. Of all the people, as a contributor here, it turns out your aunt is a very close friend of mine. So at this point, though, where we're in the interview, is I turn the microphone off and I allow you to promote. I mean, however you want to promote. You can shout out folks. The only thing, Bijoun, you cannot do is say anything about a cost or a dollar amount, but anything else, shout outs, anything else you want to do for the next couple of minutes, I'm going to turn the mic off and you have the opportunity to that, and then we'll be done.
Yeah, no problem. Oh, wow. Let's see. Okay. So I got to shout out my boo, my lady, my wife, LaToya. So first of all, just shouting her out she's watching the kids right now. We have an 11-year-old and a 5-year-old, and my wife is not a morning person. So I'm just thinking, just out loud, these vibrations will reach her, that she's, taking care of our kids right now for this past hour and change. Teamwork makes the dream work. Now, my wife is also an author, and she's a professional writer. She's a writer for her job. She works a city job. As a writer, and she also recently published a novella. It is called To the Woman in the Pink Hat, and it is a science fiction novella that actually addresses reproductive rights. It's just, I can't even, it's a mad cool concept. Just people can, Google that, To the Woman in the Pink Hat. Check it out on Amazon. It was published by Aqueduct Press, and her novella just came out. She's been working on it for quite some time, and it's doing well, and I just want more folks to know about it and see it and read it. So that's my shout out number one. I'll put a second one in and then call it a day. So I said in my bio that one of the things I like to do after school is turn students into world travelers. So for the past several years now, starting in 2017, I have been coordinating my school's travel club. I kind of resurrected the school's travel club, and we do typically one international trip a year. And I took students to Spain in 2017, to Japan in 2018, South Africa in 2019. I was not able to attend that one, but we made that happen. South Africa in 2019. 2020, we all know what happened that year. We did not travel that year. After that, and we just came back this year. We did a trip to Hawaii, where students were guided by an indigenous practitioner and just learned about the culture really from the indigenous standpoint, which was beautiful. So things like visiting Pearl Harbor, but it's not about the typical version of events that they're going to hear. It's more about how it impacted the people, there, and the history leading up to it all, and the history of occupation with the United States and militarization, and all kinds of stuff like that. So, and the name for the initiative is Brownsville Abroad. My school, Frederick Douglass Academy 7, is in Brownsville, Brooklyn. And Brownsville Abroad, anybody who wants to read up more about us, that's all. I just want to promote that, too. That's a really cool thing I've been able to do, and hopefully can continue to do it. And the plan for 2024 is Ghana. And that just, we could do a whole lot. That's, why Ghana is so meaningful and significant. And my school is predominantly black school. We have about 80-something% of the students in the school are black, which I just love that to death. And then we have, a mix of some other folks in there, too, that get to come along for the ride. So there you go.
Okay, now the trigger, because my wife at that time, a few years ago, we used to do the same thing through this company. It was called EF Tours.
Yeah, and all of our trips were through EF.
Okay, so I had the opportunity to travel, take kids abroad multiple years. I mean, we've done Germany, Italy, done France, London. I mean, we hit all of the Africa trip. Actually, the South Africa trip was in planning stages when COVID hit.
Oh.
And that wiped that out, and since that time, some other life things have happened. So we're not even together anymore. So I don't know I don't even think she's been able to pursue it because of the pandemic. But I know exactly what it is. And again, it's about exposure in terms of exposing the kids. Because I remember, as you just brought that up, I remember we were in Germany, and this particular kid now is probably about 23, 24, because at the time he was about 12. And he looked at me and said, "Mr. Medley, I cannot believe I am bike riding in Germany."
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, because we had done, as a part of the tour, we had done a bike ride, and he said, I won't forget his face and the expression, the way he said that. But I thought about that in terms of, imagine being exposed at 12 years old to an entire different country.
Yeah.
And that's what he said to me, "Mr. Medley, I can't believe I'm riding a bicycle in Germany." And like I said, he was 12 at the time, and that was 10, 11 years ago, so he's probably around 22, 23 by now. But again, and your wife's book, if it's on Kindle format, I will download it, and she can come on as a guest as well. I give her a date, and she can come on and talk about her novella.
Hey, all right, that sounds excellent. Very apropos.
So what you said, The Woman in the Pink Hat?
To the Woman in the Pink Hat.
To the Woman, because see, Amazon, I ought to be on Amazon, particularly their Kindle board of directors, because I download at least one book a day. At least, there's at least one book a day that I had already downloaded one this morning, but I'm gonna download that one when I get home. But at least one book a day I download. I spend more money on books.
You off some stock.
Yeah, I know, that's right. I spend more money on books than I do clothes, and I'm all right with that. But.
Yeah.
So I tell you what, man, it's been great. We will definitely chat again. I'm going to send you, the links to this, and you can, send it out to all your social media sites and anywhere else you want to send it, because once I get the links to you, they are yours. But I love the contribution, the chapter. Again, the book is Illmatic Consequences, the Clapback to Opponents of Critical Race Theory. The publisher of that book is Universal Right Publications, LLC. If you go to www.uwpbooks.com, you can learn all about that publishing company. So, Bijoun, have a great day. I'm going to make sure, I know Janine's listening, but I'm going to make sure I hit her up either before the day or next time I see her, and we're going to talk about it.
Yeah. Thank you so much. This was wonderful. I appreciate your time.
Thank you. Same here. Have a wonderfully blessed day and week. And I'll get all the information out to you shortly.
All right. Awesome.
Thank you. Take care.